Every town in the Old West has ghosts, but in Red Rock Springs, the ghost haunting Silas Vance wasn't buried in the cemetery. It lived inside his own guilt. For 6 long years, he believed his illiteracy had cost his wife her life, until one woman uncovered a secret powerful men were willing to kill to protect. Tonight, you'll hear a story about stolen truth, buried justice, and a cowboy finally learning how to fight back. If this story meant something to you, help us keep these stories alive. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to join our growing frontier family.
The wind doesn't lie. It tells you if rain is coming over the Capitan Mountains or if a stray is caught in the scrub. To most folks, the dawn is just light. To me, it's a song. The creak of the porch boards. The rhythmic shift of the cattle in the holding pen. The low, steady breath of the world before the sun burns the dew off the sage. I sat on my porch with a piece of paper in my hand. It was a letter from the bank in Santa Fe. I could feel the weight of the parchment. I could smell the sharp scent of the ink. But the marks on the page were just black scratches. They were a fence I couldn't climb. I looked at my mare, Ruth. She was waiting by the rail. A man without letters is a man half-chained, Ruth, I said. My voice was raspy from the morning air. It is a matter of basic human dignity. Every soul deserves the right to know his own business. If a man can read the truth for himself, he is living on the mercy of another man as honesty. And mercy is a thin blanket in a New Mexico winter. I folded the paper. I tucked it into my vest pocket, right over my heart. It felt like a stone. "Let's go," I muttered. The train won't wait for a man who is stuck in his own silence. Red Rock Springs was already humming by the time I pulled rein at the station. Dust kicked up from the freight wagons. The smell of coal smoke was thick. Sheriff Wyatt Miller was leaning against a post. He saw me and adjusted his hat. Wyatt had been my shadow for 20 years. He was the only man in the territory who knew my secret. He was the one who read me the deeds. He was the one who checked my contracts. "She's on the 10:15. Silas," Wyatt said. He looked at me, his eyes squinting against the glare. "You sure about this? A blind woman from the city? This frontier is hard on people who can see the rattlesnakes. It'll be twice as hard on someone who can tee." I stepped off Ruth and tied her to the rail. I looked Wyatt straight in the eye. "Wyatt, a person's worth isn't found in their eyes," I said. I made sure my words were clear. Every human being has an equal right to a place in this world. Being blind doesn't mean she lacks a spirit or a mind. It just means she sees the world differently. We owe it to her and to ourselves to treat her with the respect a doctoress sister deserves. Equality isn't something you give, it's something you recognize. Wyatt sighed. He tipped his hat. "I hear you, Silas. I just hope she's as tough as your philosophy." Then came the whistle. The ground shook. The steam roared out like a beast held in a cage. The iron horse groaned to a halt, huffing white clouds into the blue sky. People started pouring out. Families, drummers, men looking for work. Then the conductor stepped down. He reached back and held out a hand. She didn't take it, not at first. Abigail Sterling stepped onto the platform. She wore a dark blue traveling suit. It was dusty from the trail, but pressed sharp. She had a cane, in her right hand light wood, tipped with brass. Her head was tilted. She wasn't looking at the ground. She was listening to the station. She moved. It wasn't a stumble. It was a calculation. She tapped the wood once, twice. She found the edge of the stairs and walked down like she owned the air she breathed. She stopped 10 feet from us. She turned her face toward the smell of the horses, toward me. "Mr. Vance, I presume," she said. Her voice was like a bell in a quiet canyon. "You have the scent of cedar and old leather, and your heart is beating fast enough for me to hear it from here. I couldn't find my tongue for a second. She wasn't a girl. She was a woman who had survived things I couldn't imagine. I am Silas, I managed to say. I am Abigail, she replied. She reached out her hand. She didn't feel around for mine. She held it steady, waiting for me to meet her halfway. I believe we have a clinic to open, and I believe I have a great deal to teach this town about what it means to truly see. I took her hand. Her grip was firm. For the first time in 6 years, the letter in my pocket didn't feel quite so heavy. The buggy ride from the station was a long stretch of silence, broken only by the rhythmic clop of Ruth S. hooves and the dry rattle of the wheels against the hardpack. The air in Red Rock Springs didn't just sit. It pushed. It was heavy with the scent of sun-baked pine and the sharp, metallic tang of the desert. Abigail sat straight. She didn't lean back. She didn't clutch the side of the seat like she was afraid of the bumps. She moved with the wagon, her head slightly tilted, catching the echoes of the town as we passed the general store and the blacksmith forge. "The clinic is just ahead," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet. "It's been closed since Gideon passed. I've kept the dust off the porch, but the inside, well, it's been waiting for you." I pulled the reins. Ruth stopped. The world went still, except for the cicadas screaming in the brush. "I can smell the lavender," Abigail said. Her voice was soft, but certain. Gideon always kept a patch by the door. He said it reminded him that even in the harshest places, there is room for something gentle. It is a fundamental truth, Mr. Vance. Gentleness is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of a civilized heart. I hopped down. I went around to help her, but she was already stepping off the buggy. Her brass-tipped cane found the dirt before her boot did. "I have the key," I said. "Then lead the way, Silas. But do not pull me. I am a woman with my own feet. To lead a person without their consent is to treat them as an object, and every human being has the right to their own agency." I felt the heat crawl up my neck. "I meant no disrespect, Miss Abigail. I know you didn't. But we must be clear from the start. Respect is a choice we make in every small movement. It is the acknowledgement that my path is mine to walk, even if I walk it in a different kind of light than you do." I walked up the 3 steps. The wood was silvered by the sun. I turned the key. The lock was stubborn, but it gave way with a heavy thunk. I pushed the door open. The smell hit us first. It was a mixture of dried herbs, old paper, and the cold, clean scent of liniment. It was Gideon-esque smell. It was the smell of a man who spent his life trying to fix what was broken. Abigail stepped inside. She didn't wait for me to describe the room. She stood in the center of the floor and closed her eyes, though I suppose they were always closed to the world I saw. She took a deep breath. "The desk is to the left," she whispered. "Heavy oak, facing the window." Gideon liked the sun on his hands while he wrote. "That S right?" I said. I was leaning against the doorframe, watching her. "The exam table is 10 paces ahead, slightly to the right, to avoid the draft from the door." She started walking. She didn't use the cane like a blind man in a picture book, swinging it wild. She tapped it light, precise. 1, 2. 1, 2. She moved around the crates I'd stacked in the corner, like she could see them through the soles of her boots. "Silas," she said, stopping by the tall cabinets. "Information is the greatest tool a person can possess." My brother understood that. He believed that education is the only true equalizer in a republic. If a man knows his history, and he knows his rights, he cannot be easily led by those who wish to profit from his ignorance. I looked at the floor. My vest pocket felt heavy. The bank letter was still there. "I reckon that S true," I muttered. It is more than true. It is a moral imperative, she said, turning toward me. Her unseeing eyes seemed to look right through my chest. To keep a man from learning is a crime against his potential. It is a way of stealing his future before he even has a chance to live it. That is why Gideon kept such meticulous records. He wanted his patients to have a history. He wanted them to have a voice that lasted longer than their breath. She moved toward the desk. Her fingers grazed the wood. She found the stack of files I'd brought in from the back room a few days prior. These were the names of every soul in Red Rock Springs. The births, the deaths, the broken bones, and the fevers. "Help me with these," she said. I walked over. My hands were calloused and scarred. They were hands for ropes and branding irons, not for delicate paper. I picked up a thick folder. "Which one is this?" she asked. I looked at the marks on the cover. I knew the shape of the letters, in a way. I'd have seen them on the signs in town. But they didn't speak to me. They were just fences. It's a big one," I said. My heart started that fast-beating rhythm again, the one she'd heard at the station. Lots of pages. Abigail reached out. Her hand brushed mine. Her fingers were cool. She took the file from me. She didn't look at the cover. With her eyes, she ran her thumb along the bottom edge. She stopped. Her face changed. "There is a mark here," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. "A heavy mark, 2 lines crossing, an X." I couldn't breathe. The air in the clinic had suddenly gone thin. "That's the Vance file," I whispered. "My file." She didn't say anything for a long time. She sat down in Gideon S. chair. She opened the folder. Her fingers moved over the pages inside. These weren't the red dots she used. These were Gideon S. handwritten notes. Ink on paper. But Gideon had been a man of many secrets. His sister would come here. He had known how her mind worked. He had left her a map, hidden in the texture of the ink and the pressure of the pen. Abigail's fingers traced a line of writing. Then she found a note tucked into the back. A piece of parchment with raised markings, her language. She read it in silence. Her fingertips danced across the page. "Silas," she said. She didn't look up. "My brother wrote something here. He wrote about a man with a mind like a steel trap and a heart like an open range. A man who could remember the lineage of every cow in the valley, but couldn't read the name on his own gate." The silence in the room was like a physical weight. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to get on Ruth and ride until the sun went down. "He says here that you came to him," she continued. "He says you asked him to teach you. He says you were the most intelligent pupil he ever had, but that you were haunted by a shadow of shame." I gripped the edge of the desk. "It wasn't just shame, Miss Abigail. It was fear. In this world, if people think you re-slow, they take from you. They take your land. They take your pride." I spent building a life on a foundation of silence. I couldn't let anyone see the crack. Abigail stood up. She moved around the desk until she was standing right in front of me. She reached out and touched my arm. "Silas Vance, listen to me," she said. Her voice was firm. It was the voice of the school teacher she used to be. "Shame is a poison that we brew for ourselves. It serves no purpose but to keep us small. There is no lack of dignity in not knowing. The only lack of dignity is in refusing to learn." She paused, letting the words sink in. "A man who admits his limitations is a man who is ready to transcend them," she said. "Vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. It is the source of it. To be honest about who we are is the highest form of courage. You have spent your life protecting a secret, but that secret has become your prison. Don't you see? Every human being deserves the right to walk in the sun without a mask." I looked down at her. She was small, but she felt like a giant in that room. I tried, I said, with Gideon. But then Sarah got sick, and the letter came. And I couldn't read it. And by the time I got Wyatt to tell me what it said, she was gone. I decided then that I didn't deserve the words. If I couldn't save her, I didn't deserve to know anything else. That is a lie you told yourself to survive the grief, Abigail said, but it is a lie that denies your own worth. You are a person of value, Silas. Not because of what you can or cannot do, but because of who you are. And who you are is a man who deserves to be his own witness. She turned back to the desk and picked up my file. I am going to open this clinic, she said, and you are going to help me. But we are going to do more than heal bodies. We are going to reclaim what was stolen from you. We are going to prove that the mind has no boundaries, even if the eyes or the books suggest otherwise. I looked at the X on the cover of the file. It looked different now. It didn't look like a mark of failure. It looked like a crossroads. Why help me? I asked. You don't know me. I'm just a cowboy with a lot of dirt on his boots. Abigail smiled. It was the first real smile I'd seen on her. It lit up the room better than the New Mexico sun. Because, Silas, the world is full of people who want to keep others in the dark so they can feel superior. I have spent 8 years fighting people who think I am less because I cannot see. I will not stand by and watch you do the same to yourself. Solidarity is the bridge that carries us over the canyons of our own making. We are in this together. That is the only way a community survives. I took a breath. A real one. Where do we start? I asked. We start by admitting that we both have things to teach and things to learn, she said. Now, tell me, what does the wind smell like today? I need to know the land before I can serve the people. I looked out the window at the red rocks and the vast open sky. It smells like rain, I said, a long way off. But it's coming. It's coming for all of us. Abigail nodded. Good. Rain washes away the old dust. It makes the ground ready for something new. I stood there in Gideon S. Clinic with the blind schoolteacher and the files of 1,000 lives, and I felt the chains of 20 years begin to rattle. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something deeper. It was the recognition of one soul to another, the cowboy and the teacher, the man who couldn't see the words and the woman who couldn't see the world. We were just getting started. The sun didn't just rise the next morning. It broke over the ridge like a promise that was too heavy to keep. I sat on my porch, watching the light crawl across the dust. My hands felt restless. They were used to the weight of a lariat or the rough grain of a fence post. But after yesterday, everything felt different. The wood of my own chair felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. I thought about Abigail. I thought about the way she spoke. She didn't use words like a weapon, the way some city folks do. She used them like tools, clean, precise. She had lanced the boil of my secret with one sentence, and I was still waiting for the sting to fade. I stood up. My joints popped. Time to move, Silas, I told the empty air. A man who stands still too long starts to rot from the inside out, and a rot in the soul is a far sight worse than a rot in the timber. I saddled Ruth and rode into town. The air was crisp, but you could feel the heat waiting in the wings. Red Rock Springs was waking up. I saw Sheriff Wyatt standing outside his office, nursing a cup of coffee that looked like axle grease. He watched me ride by. He didn't wave. He just nodded. That was Wyatt. He knew when a man was carrying a load, and he knew better than to add his own weight to it. I pulled up at the clinic. Abigail was already on the porch. She was wearing a sturdy apron over her dress. She held a broom and she was sweeping the dust with a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Swish thump, swish thump. You're early, Mr. Vance, she said. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. Horses don't sleep in, and neither do I said, hopping down. You look like you at war with that dust. I am, she said, leaning on the broom. A clean environment is the first step in healing. It is a matter of basic human rights, Silas. Every person, no matter how poor or how sick, deserves to be treated in a place that respects their dignity. If we don't care for the space, we aren't truly caring for the people. I walked up the steps. I took the broom from her hand. I'll finish the porch, I said. You go inside and tell me what needs moving. I saw a couple of heavy cabinets in the back that looked like they'd been there since the flood. Abigail didn't argue. She stepped back and smoothed her apron. Thank you, but I want to help. Collaboration is the only way a community thrives. If one person does all the labor while the other just watches, it breeds a lopsided kind of respect. We are partners in this, Silas. That means we share the sweat as well as the success. I looked at her. She was barely 5 feet tall. Those cabinets are oak, Miss Abigail. They weigh more than you do. I have a lever, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. And I have a mind. Archimedes said that if he had a long enough lever and a place to stand, he could move the world. Physical strength is a fine thing, but it is the application of intelligence that truly changes our circumstances. I chuckled. I reckon I'm the lever, and you are the place to stand. Exactly, she said. We went inside. The clinic felt different in the full light of day. It didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like a workshop. Abigail pointed to a massive glass-fronted cabinet in the corner. It was filled with empty bottles and old bandages. That needs to go against the north wall, she said. The light is better there for sorting. And transparency is important in medicine. People should be able to see what is being used to treat them. Secret tonics and hidden ingredients are the tools of charlatans. True science is open for all to understand. I braced my shoulder against the oak. It groaned. I pushed, and the wood screeched against the floorboards. Abigail was right there, using a piece of scrap wood to help slide the base. We worked for an hour, moving the heavy pieces. My shirt was damp with sweat. Her face was flushed, but she didn't quit. When the last cabinet was in place, I sat down on a crate and wiped my forehead. You're a stubborn woman, I said. Persistence is a virtue, Silas, she replied, sitting on the edge of the exam table, especially when the world tells you to stay quiet and stay still. Many people believe that because I cannot see, I have no role to play in the heavy lifting of life. But to be excluded from work is to be excluded from the human experience. Everyone has a right to contribute. To deny someone that right is to deny them their place in the sun. I looked at the room. It was starting to look like something real. I spent my life thinking work was just a way to pay the bills, I said. I never thought about it being a right. That is because you have never been told you weren't allowed to do it, Abigail said softly. Privilege is often invisible to those who possess it. It is like the air we breathe. We only notice it when it's taken away. Being able to work, to read, to speak your mind, these are the foundations of freedom. Without them, we are just shadows moving in a world built by others. She stood up and walked over to the desk. She felt for a small box I'd brought in from the wagon. Inside were the letters of the alphabet, carved out of wood. I'd made them years ago. A project I'd started with Gideon and then abandoned. These are the keys, Silas, she said, her fingers tracing the curve of an S. I know. No, I whispered. No, you don't. Not yet. You think these are just shapes, but they are more than that. They are the building blocks of justice. If you cannot read the contracts you sign, you are at the mercy of the man with the pen. And power without accountability is a dangerous thing. Every citizen has a moral obligation to be literate, because a society of the ignorant is a society of the enslaved. I felt the weight of her words. They were heavier than the oak cabinet. I am 44 years old. Abigail, is it even possible to change the way a brain works at my age? The mind is like the soil. Silas, it doesn't matter how long it has laid fallow. If you turn the earth and give it water, things will grow. Growth is the natural state of the living. To suggest that an adult cannot learn is to suggest that their life is effectively over, and I refuse to believe that about any human being. She held out the wooden S. This is the first sound of your name. S, like the wind in the grass, like the steam from the engine. Sound is the father of the word, Silas. We begin with what we hear, and we bridge the gap to what we see or what we feel. I took the letter from her. I closed my eyes, trying to see the world as she did. The wood was smooth, cold. It had a sharp corner and a long, sweeping curve. S, I said. Good. Now, tell me, why do you want to learn? Is it just for the bank letters? I thought about Sarah. I thought about the letter that had arrived too late. I thought about the way ID looked at the X on my marriage license and felt like a fraud. I want to be a whole man, I said. I want to be able to stand on my own 2 feet without needing someone to tell me where the ground is. I want to be able to read the truth for myself. Because if a man doesn't know the truth, he's just a leaf in a storm. Abigail nodded. Self-reliance is a noble goal. But remember this. Being independent doesn't mean you have to be alone. No man is an island, Silas. We are all part of a larger tapestry. Learning to read will give you independence, but it will also give you a way to connect with the thoughts of people who lived 100 years ago and 1,000 miles away. It is a way to join the great conversation of humanity. She stood up and walked to the door. She stood on the threshold, her face turned toward the street. Tomorrow we begin the lessons in earnest, she said. But for today, look at this clinic. We moved the weight together. We made a space for the broken to be mended. That is a good day's work. I followed her out. As I locked the door, I saw a man across the street. He was tall, dressed in a suit that cost more than my ranch. He was watching us. He had a look in his eye that I didn't like. It was the look of a hawk watching a nest. Who is that? Abigail asked. She had felt my tension. A stranger, I said, in a fancy suit. Wealth and fine clothes are often used as a mask for a lack of character, Abigail said, her voice steady. We must be cautious, Silas. The frontier attracts those who want to build, but it also attracts those who want to take. And those who take usually start by targeting the ones they perceive as weak. I looked at the man, then at the small woman beside me. He's in for a surprise then, I said, because I don't see any weak folks on this porch. Abigail meme-cooed. Strength is not always in the muscle, Silas. It is in the resolve, and our resolve is just beginning to harden. I walked her back to the boarding house, the wooden S still tucked in my pocket. The town felt bigger. The sky felt higher. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a lesson. And I was finally ready to learn. The air inside the clinic carried the ghost of the morning rain, even though the sun was already baking the dust outside. It was a smell of damp earth and old cedar. I liked it. It felt like the world was settling into its skin. Abigail was sitting at Gideon S. desk. She wasn't sweeping today. She was waiting. On the desk sat a small leather-bound book. I knew that book. It was Gideon S. personal journal. He used to carry it in his saddlebag, tucked between his stethoscope and his Bible. You found his diary, I said, closing the door behind me. I found his truth, Silas, Abigail replied. Her fingers were resting on the cover. A diary is more than a record of dates and weather. It is a man's private counsel. It is his legacy. Every person has a right to their own history, Silas. To be remembered correctly is a fundamental human dignity. Without a written record, a person's life is at the mercy of the fading memories of others. I sat down in the chair across from her. It creaked. Gideon was a good man for remembering folks. He knew who had the croup 3 winters ago and who had a bad heart. He knew more than that, Abigail said. She opened the book. She turned the pages until she felt a small notch she had made in the corner of one. He wrote about you, Silas. He wrote about the sessions you had, but more importantly, he wrote about why you stopped. He wrote about your father. I felt a coldness settle in my gut. It was a familiar ghost, one I had tried to bury under miles of fence line and years of silence. My father didn't have much use for books, I said. I kept my voice steady, but it was a struggle. He thought they made a man soft. He thought if you were looking at a page, you weren't looking at the horizon. And if you weren't looking at the horizon, you were going to lose your cattle or your life. That is a fallacy, Abigail said, her voice sharpening. Ignorance is not a shield, it is a blindfold. To intentionally keep a child from learning is a form of intellectual theft. It is the stealing of a person's potential before they even know they possess it. It is a parent's duty to expand a child's world, not to shrink it to the size of a cowpen. I leaned back. The memory came unbidden, the smell of cheap whiskey, the heavy weight of a leather belt, the way the light from the kerosene lamp had flickered on the pages of the only book we owned, a ragged copy of Pilgrim's Progress. He caught me with it once, I whispered. I was 10. I was trying to figure out the long words. He didn't just take the book, he burned it. Then he showed me what happened to dreamers in his house. He told me that words were for people who wanted to lie to themselves, he said. A man's only truth was in his hands. Abigail reached across the desk. She didn't find my hand, but she rested her palm on the wood between us. Your father was wrong, Silas. Painfully, dangerously wrong, she said. The hands can build a house, but it is the mind that makes it a home. And the idea that literacy is weak is a tool used by tyrants and bullies to keep people under their thumb. If you cannot read the law, you cannot claim its protection. If you cannot read the scripture, you're at the mercy of any man who claims to speak for God. Education is the bedrock of a free society. Without it, the individual is always at the whim of the powerful. I knew that, in a way, I said. That's why I went to Gideon. But every time I saw those letters, I could feel that belt. I could hear his voice telling me I was wasting my time. I was a man grown, and I was still scared of a dead man's ghost. Shame is a social construct, Silas, Abigail said. It is a weapon designed to keep us in our place. But shame cannot survive the light of truth. You are not a failure because you didn't learn. You are a survivor of an environment that tried to starve your intellect. To acknowledge that is the first step in reclaiming your power. We have a moral obligation to seek knowledge, regardless of the obstacles placed in our path by the past. She picked up the wooden S from yesterday. Beside it, she placed a wooden A. S for Silas. A for Abigail, she said. 2 lives, 2 stories. And today, we begin the next chapter. Tell me, Silas, what is the value of a name? I looked at the A. It was a sharp point with a bridge across the middle. It's who you are, I said. It's how folks know you writ there. Exactly. A name is your claim to existence, Abigail said. To be able to write your own name is to sign your own social contract. It is the announcement that you are a person of consequence, with rights that cannot be ignored. Every human being has a right to their own identity. To be unable to write one S name is to be a ghost in the eyes of the law. She took my hand. She didn't ask. She just guided my fingers over the A. Feel the peak, she said. It is like the roof of a house, or the mountains to the west. Stable, strong. This is the first sound of my name. Ah, like the breath you take when you're re-surprised, or the sound of the wind through the pines. I traced the wood. I felt the grain. I felt the bridge. A, I said. My voice was a little thicker than before. A, she repeated. Now, Silas, listen to me. We are going to do something Gideon couldn't do. We are going to move past the fear. Because fear is an illiterate state of being. Knowledge is the only cure for the ghosts of the past. And you are a man who is worthy of that cure. We sat there for a long time. The town went on outside. I heard the stagecoach pull in. I heard the blacksmith's hammer, but inside the clinic, the only thing that mattered was the bridge on the A. Why does it matter so much to you? I asked. You could just open the clinic. You could just be the doctor's sister. Folks would respect you for that. Abigail pulled her hand back and sat up straight. Because, Silas, the social contract requires us to help one another reach our full potential. If I see a man drowning and I have a rope, I am morally compelled to throw it. To ignore your struggle would be to diminish my own humanity. We are all bound together by our common needs. And the need for light, for understanding, is as real as the need for bread or water. She stood up and walked toward the window. She didn't need to see the street to know it was there. That man in the suit, she said, the one you saw yesterday. He was back this morning. He was standing by the well. He wasn't drinking. He was watching. Thaddeus Thorne, I said. I'd spent the morning asking around at the livery. He is a land agent for the railroad. He has been in Santa Fe for a year, buying up rights. He is a man who believes that progress is more important than people. Progress without ethics is just a polished form of plunder, Abigail said. Her voice was cold now. If he is here for the railroad, he is here for the land. And if he is here for the land, he will look for the people he thinks won't fight back. He will look for the ones he thinks are weak. I stood up. I felt the letter from the bank in my pocket. I felt the S and the A on the desk. He thinks I am one of them, I said. Then we must ensure he is mistaken, Abigail replied, because justice is not something that happens by accident. It is something we must build, piece by piece, just like we are building your literacy. Knowledge is your armor, Silas, and we are going to make sure it fits you perfectly. I looked at the wooden letters. They didn't look like scratches anymore. They looked like tools. They looked like weapons. Let S do another one, I said. Show me the V for Vance. Abigail Mimkui. The V, like a valley, or the wings of a hawk. It is the shape of a choice, Silas, and today you chose the right path. I walked home that night under a canopy of stars. The desert was quiet, but the silence didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a blank page, and for the first time in 44 years, I knew I was the one who was going to write on it. Because Abigail was right. A man has a right to his own story, and I was tired of being a ghost in mine. The sun was a hammer today. It beat down on the rest of the street until the air itself seemed to shimmer and shake. Red Rock Springs was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Most folks were hiding in the shade of the porches, but I was in the clinic. I was staring at a wooden letter T. Thorne, I said. The word felt like a burr in my throat. And town, Abigail added. She was sitting across from me, her hands folded neatly on the desk. And truth. They all begin with the same strike of the pen, Silas. A vertical line for strength, and a horizontal line for the roof that covers us. I traced the wood with my thumb. It seems a lot of things start with T lately. Most of them I don't care for. That is the nature of language, Abigail said. Her voice was calm, but there was a weight to it today. Words are neutral tools, Silas. They are like a holster. They can carry a weapon of malice or a tool for justice. It is the intent of the speaker that gives the word its sting or its balm. We have a moral obligation to use our speech to build, not to destroy. To use a word to deceive is to poison the well of human trust. I looked out the window. Thaddeus Thorne was crossing the street. He didn't walk like the rest of us. He didn't watch for the ruts or the horse signs. He walked like he owned the dirt and the sky above it. He was heading straight for the clinic. "He's coming," I whispered. "I know," Abigail said. I heard his boots on the boardwalk 3 doors down. He walks with the stride of a man who expects the world to move for him. The door didn't just open. It was invaded. Thorne stepped inside, bringing the heat and the scent of expensive bay rum with him. He took off his hat, revealing hair that was slicked back with more grease than a wagon axle. He looked around the clinic with a thin, sharp smile. "Abigail," he said. He didn't call her Miss Sterling. He spoke her name like he was reclaiming a piece of lost luggage. "I heard you'd made it to this God-forsaken edge of the world. I didn't believe it until I saw the sign." I stood up. My chair barked against the floorboards. I didn't like the way he looked at her. It was the look of a man counting his coins. "Mr. Thorne," Abigail said. She didn't stand. She sat like a queen on a wooden throne. "Your presence is a surprise. Usually, land agents stay where the chairs are soft and the whiskey is imported." Thorne laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "I go where the opportunity is, Abigail. And right now, the opportunity is right beneath Mr. Vance's boots. I believe you met Silas. He is the one who signs his life away with an X." He looked at me then. His eyes were like cold glass. "Vance," he said, "I've been to the land office. I know your borders. I also know your bank is holding a note that's looking a bit frayed at the edges. I am here to offer you a way out, a generous price for the Rourke Ranch. Enough for you to go, find a nice patch of dirt where the railroad doesn't care to go." I felt the heat in my chest rising. I thought about the letter in my pocket. I thought about the letters on the desk. "My land isn't for sale," I said, "and my business with the bank is my own." "Is it?" Thorne stepped closer. He leaned his hands on the desk right next to the wooden tee. "In a territory like this, Silas, private business is a luxury for men who can read the fine print. The railroad is progress. It is an unstoppable force of history. To stand in its way is not just foolish. It is a crime against the future of this territory." Abigail spoke then, her voice cutting through his bravado like a sharp blade. "Progress, Thaddeus, is a word often used to dress up greed," she said. "If your railroad requires the displacement of honest men from their homes without their consent, it is not progress. It is plunder. Every individual has an inherent right to the property they have built with their own labor. To use the law as a lever to pry a man from his land is a violation of the social contract that binds us all." Thorne turned to her, his smile fading. "Always the school teacher, Abigail. Still quoting the philosophers while the world moves on without you. You were always too smart for your own good. That's why Susan was the better match for a man with ambition." The room went cold. I looked at Abigail. Her face didn't move, but I saw her grip the edge of the desk until her knuckles went white. Susan, I repeated. The name clicked into place. She's your sister. My wife, Thorne said, looking at me with a smirk. Which makes Abigail family in a twisted sort of way. I am here to look after her interests, Silas. And her interests involve getting her back to Philadelphia, where she belongs. Not in a dusty shack, with a man who can even read the name of the woman he is trying to protect. He turned back to Abigail. Think about it, Abby. This town doesn't want a blind doctor's sister. They want a real doctor, and they want the railroad. If you stay here, you read just a stone in the path. Come home, let me handle the Vance property, and I'll ensure you be taken care of. Abigail stood up slowly. She used her cane to find her center. She looked in the direction of Thorne's voice, and for a second, I would have sworn she was looking right through his skull. Listen to me. Thaddeus, she said. Her voice was a low, steady thrum. Wealth does not grant you the right to govern the lives of others. Ambition does not excuse the lack of a conscience. You speak of the railroad as a god, but it is just a machine built by men. And if those men forget that their power comes from the consent of the people, they are not leaders. They are tyrants. She paused, taking a breath. My sister may have chosen to hitch her wagon to your star, but I have not. I am a person of independent mind and agency. I stay where I am needed, and Silas Vance needs a partner who respects his dignity, not a vulture who wants to pick his bones. Every human being, Silas included, has a right to be treated as an end in themselves, not as a means to your profit. Thorne's face went red. He grabbed his hat and jammed it onto his head. You re a fool, Abigail, he spat. And you, Vance, you re a dead man walking. You don't have the tools to fight me. You don't have the words. By the time I am done, the law will take that ranch, and you won't even be able to read the eviction notice. He turned on his heel and slammed the door. The dust he brought in swirled in the shafts of sunlight. I sat back down. I felt like I'd been in a fistfight. My heart was thumping against my ribs. He's my brother-in-law, Abigail whispered. She sat back down, her hands shaking just a little. I'm sorry, Silas. I should have told you. But I hoped he had stayed in Santa Fe. He's a bad man, I said. He is a man who believes that power is the only truth, Abigail said. And that is the most dangerous kind of ignorance. It is a moral failure to believe that one's own desires are more important than the rights of others. We are all equal under the moral law, Silas. Thaddeus thinks his money makes him a giant, but it only makes him a louder kind of small. She reached out and found the wooden T. She handed it to me. He was right about one thing, Silas, she said. He thinks you don't have the tools to fight him. He thinks your lack of literacy is a hole in your armor. But we are going to fix that, because knowledge is the only shield that truly holds against a man like him. If you can read the law, he cannot lie to you. If you can write your own story, he cannot erase you. I looked at the T, Thorne Town, Truth. He said something about the bank, I said. He said they were holding a note. He is trying to frighten you into a mistake. Abigail replied, Fear is the enemy of reason. We must be methodical. We must be precise. We must treat this as a lesson in justice. Every person has a right to defend their livelihood, and the best defense is an informed mind. I looked at her. She was small, and she couldn't see the man who had just threatened us, but she stood taller than any sheriff I'd ever known. I'm not leaving this ranch, Abigail, I said, and I'm not letting him take you back to Philadelphia. Then we have work to do, she said. She picked up the wooden A. A for Abigail. A for accountability. In this room, Silas, we don't sign with an X. We sign with the full weight of our names, because our names are the only thing we truly own. I spent the next 2 hours learning the letters of my own name, Silas. It was hard. It was like trying to break a colt that didn't want to be ridden. My fingers cramped. My eyes ached. But every time I felt like quitting, I thought about Thaddeus Thorne's cold glass eyes. "One more time," Abigail said. "Sound it out. The sound is the soul of the letter." Silas, I said. "Good. You are claiming yourself, Silas Vance. You are taking your place in the conversation, and that is, a right no railroad can ever take away." I walked out of the clinic as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The red rocks were glowing like embers. I saw Thorne standing on the balcony of the hotel, smoking a cigar. He looked down at me, his face a shadow. I didn't look away. I didn't touch my hat. I just walked to my horse and swung into the saddle. I had the T and the A and the S in my head. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was carrying more than just a gun. I was carrying the truth, and the truth was a heavy thing to carry. But it sure did make a man stand up straight. The night was a heavy blanket, black and still, pinned down by stars that looked like ice. The heat of the day had vanished into the sagebrush, leaving the clinic cold. I sat at the small table in the corner. A single candle flickered between us. It cast long, dancing shadows on the jars of tinctures and the rows of white bandages. I was holding a pencil. It felt like a piece of iron in my hand. "Again," Abigail said. Her voice was a soft anchor in the dark. "S-R-H," I whispered. I traced the letters on the slate. Each one was a jagged mountain I had to climb. "Sarah," Abigail repeated. She sat perfectly still. "She was your wife. She was your heart. And names, Silas, are the most sacred words we own. To write a person's name is to keep them alive in the world of the living. It is a fundamental act of remembrance. We have a moral duty to preserve the names of those who came before us, because a person is only truly gone when their name is no longer spoken or written." I laid the pencil down. My hand was shaking. I haven't written that name in 6 years. I haven't even looked at it. I thought if I didn't see it, the guilt wouldn't find me. "Guilt is a shadow, Silas," Abigail said. "It doesn't need light to exist. It grows in the dark. It feeds on the things we don't say." She reached out across the table. Her fingers found the edge of the slate. She didn't touch the letters, but she leaned toward them. "Silas," she said, her voice turning grave. "I spent the afternoon with Gideon's Moore. Private files. The ones he kept in the locked box under the floorboards. I read them with my hands. He had a way of pressing the pen so hard the truth rose up through the back of the page." I looked at her. My heart was a drum in a hollow chest. "What did he write?" "He wrote about Sarah," she said. "He wrote about the autumn of 1872, the fever, the way it took the town. But mostly, he wrote about a letter from a specialist in Santa Fe, a man who had studied the very thing that was killing her." I stood up. I couldn't sit still. I paced the small room, the floorboards groaning under my boots. "I know about the letter," I said. My voice was a rasp. "It sat on my mantel for 3 days. 3 days, Abigail. I looked at the seal. I looked at the ink. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a bill, or an advertisement for a new plow. By the time I took it to Wyatt, it was over. Gideon told me then that the instructions inside could have saved her. I've carried that every day since. I am the reason she is in the ground." Abigail stood up, too. She didn't need her cane in this small space. She knew every inch of it now. She moved around the table until she was standing right in front of me. "No, Silas. Listen to me," she said. She grabbed my forearms. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Every human being has a right to the information that affects their survival. To withhold that information is a crime against life itself. It is a violation of the most basic human right, the right to live and to make informed choices for one's own family. I didn't withhold it, I argued. I just couldn't read it. It wasn't your illiteracy that killed her, Silas, she said, her voice rising with a sudden, sharp authority. Gideon's notes are clear. The letter you received, it wasn't the original. It was a copy that had been opened, held, and then resealed. Gideon did an autopsy of the situation, not just the body. He went to the post office. He found that the original letter, the one sent with a urgent mark, had arrived in Red Rock Springs a full week before you saw that copy. I stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt. A week? A week, Abigail confirmed. And it hadn't been delivered to your ranch. It had been delivered to the land office, to Harrison Thorne, Thaddeus' father. I felt the blood drain from my face. The cold I had felt earlier turned into a searing, white-hot coal in my gut. Harrison Thorne, I whispered. He was the one who offered to buy the ranch right after the funeral. He said he wanted to help a grieving neighbor. He didn't want to help, Abigail said. She let go of my arms and turned toward the window, her silhouette dark against the starlight. He wanted the water rights. He knew the railroad was coming even then. He intercepted that letter to create a crisis. He waited until it was too late to save her. Then he sent a copy to your house to ensure you would feel the weight of the loss. He wanted you broken, Silas, because a broken man is a man who stops fighting for what is his. I sat back down on the crate. The silence of the clinic felt different now. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a crime scene. He killed her, I said. The words were heavy. Final. He committed a grave moral evil, Abigail said. She turned back to me. He denied you the truth. And truth, Silas, is the air that justice breathes. Without it, we are all just drowning in the whims of the powerful. A person's right to their own mail, to their own information, is a pillar of a free society. To interfere with it is to steal a person's future. She walked back to the table and picked up the pencil. She handed it to me. This is why you must learn, she said. Not just for the bank, not just for the ranch, but because the truth is your only defense against men who think your ignorance is their opportunity. Knowledge is not a luxury, Silas. It is a shield. It is the only way to ensure that you are never again a victim of someone else's silence. I looked at the pencil. I looked at the name on the slate, Sarah. All these years, I said, I thought I was the villain. I thought my father was right, that being dumb was a death sentence. Your father was a man who used fear to cover his own failings, Abigail said. Her voice was gentle now, but the steel was still there. And the Thorne family used your lack of education as a weapon. But a weapon only works if the target doesn't see it coming. Now, you see it. And now, you have the right no, the obligation to arm yourself with the word. She sat down beside me. Every person deserves the truth of their own life, she said. To be lied to is to be treated as less than human. It is to be stripped of your dignity. We are going to find the rest of the records, Silas. We are going to find the proof of what Harrison Thorne did, and we are going to hold Thaddeus accountable for the legacy of his father's greed. I took the pencil. I gripped it so hard. The wood groaned. He still here, I said. Thaddeus. He staying at the hotel. He waiting for me to break again. Then we shall disappoint him, Abigail said. She mim-cooed, and for a second, the darkness in the room seemed to lift. Because a man who can read his own history is a man who cannot be conquered by a ghost. Justice is a slow-moving river, Silas, but it eventually grinds even the hardest stone to sand. We must be patient. We must be precise. And we must be literate. I looked at the slate again. I saw the S, the A, the R, the A, the H. I wrote it again. This time, my hand didn't shake. I wrote it because she had a right to be remembered. I wrote it because I had a right to know she hadn't died because of me. Thank you, I said. Do not thank me, Abigail replied. Simply learn. It is the highest form of gratitude you can show to the truth. To value one's mind is to value the gift of life itself. We are more than our mistakes, Silas. We are the choices we make today. I walked her back to Mrs. Crane's boarding house a few minutes later. The town was still asleep. The wind was whispering through the dry grass. It didn't sound like a ghost anymore. It sounded like a voice. I stood on the porch of the ranch that night, looking out at the dark hills. I thought about Sarah, I thought about the letter, and I thought about the blind woman who had given me back my soul. Thaddeus Thorne wanted my land. He wanted my water. He thought he could take them because I didn't have the words to stop him. He was wrong, because tomorrow I was going to learn the word justice. And then I was going to learn the word reckoning. And I wasn't going to stop until I could write every single one of them. The heat didn't break. It just got heavier. It sat on the rooftops of Red Rock Springs like a tired predator. I was at the clinic, helping Abigail move the last of Gideon's crates. My hands were becoming familiar with the shapes of the bottles. I was becoming familiar with the shapes of the letters on the labels, too. I was learning. Slowly, but every word felt like a small victory over the man I used to be. We heard the carriage before we saw it. It wasn't a buckboard or a freight wagon. It had the fine, light rattle of a city carriage. Expensive springs, polished wood. It stopped right out front. Abigail stopped moving. She tilted her head. Thaddeus, she whispered. He S brought a carriage. He S brought an end to the conversation. He's brought a fight, I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. Thaddeus Thorne stepped onto the porch. He didn't knock. He just walked in. He looked at the clinic, at the clean floors and the organized shelves, and he sneered. It was a look of pure, concentrated condescension. Abigail, he said, the carriage is waiting. Your trunk is already being packed at the boarding house. It's time to leave this graveyard and go back to a place with sidewalks. Abigail didn't flinch. She sat down behind Gideon's desk. She looked toward his voice with a calm that made me proud. I am not going, Thaddeus, she said. Don't be a child, Thorne snapped. You are blind. You are alone. You are living in a shack in a territory that hasn't even decided if it belongs to the Union yet. It is my duty as your family to ensure you are safe. Abigail leaned forward. The lamplight caught the silver in her hair. Safety is a cage when it is forced upon a person. Thaddeus, she said. Her voice was rhythmic, steady, and clear. Listen to me, because this is a lesson you seem to have forgotten. Every human being has an inherent right to their own agency. To choose one's own path, even if that path is difficult, even if it leads through the dust, is the very essence of being a person. When you try to decide my life for me, you aren't protecting me. You are erasing me. Thorne laughed, but it was a jagged, ugly sound. You talk about rights? You have a right to be cared for. You have a right to not starve in the desert. I have a right to my own dignity, Abigail countered. And dignity requires the freedom to make my own mistakes. To be cared for by someone who treats me like a piece of baggage is a form of spiritual death. Equality means recognizing that I am the sole owner of my future. My lack of sight does not mean a lack of soul or a lack of will. To suggest us otherwise is a prejudice that hides behind the mask of kindness. Thorn turned his gaze to me. His eyes were like cold flint. And you, Vance, he spat. You re-encouraging this. You re-keeping her here so you can use her. So she can read your mail while you play at being a rancher. You re-a thief of her time. I walked over. I stood next to Abigail S. chair. I didn't reach for my gun. I reached for the wooden letter A on the desk. I am not keeping her, Thorn, I said. I am standing by her. There is a difference. One is a chain, the other is a choice. And since I started learning my letters, I've learned something else, too. A man S. worth isn't found in what he takes from the world. It is found in what he respects. And I respect her right to be exactly who she wants to be. Thorn stepped closer, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. You were both fools. I have the papers. I have the banknotes. I will have this land, and I will have my sister-in-law on that train by Friday. You have nothing but paper, that is, Abigail said, and paper can burn. But the truth is a bedrock. You think you can buy a life like you buy a railroad right-of-way. But a life is not a commodity. Human life is an end in itself, not a means to your profit. To treat people as tools for your ambition is the greatest moral failure a man can commit. Thorn didn't have an answer for that. He just stared at her. He looked at the blind woman who was more settled in her soul than he would ever be in his. Friday, he said. He jammed his hat onto his head. The train leaves at noon. Be on it, Abigail, or the law will find a way to put you there. He slammed the door. The glass rattled. The dust settled back into the cracks. Abigail exhaled. It was a long, shaky breath. She reached out and found my hand. He won't stop, Silas, she said. Neither will I said. I've spent 44 years being a ghost. I'm done with that. I've decided to stay, too, not because I have to, because I choose to. Choice, she whispered. It's a beautiful word, isn't it? It's the best one yet, I said. I looked at the wooden A for Abigail, A for agency. We had made our stand. But I knew the frontier. I knew that when a man like Thorn couldn't win with words, he'd have found a heavier way to speak. I had to be ready. I had to find the rest of the truth before the Friday train pulled into the station. The truth was hidden in a silver star. The next morning, the air was still and hot. I didn't go to the clinic. I went to the sheriff's office. Wyatt Miller was sitting at his desk, cleaning a Winchester. He didn't look up when I walked in. He didn't have to. He knew my step. You look like a man with a burr under his saddle, Silas, Wyatt said. I am a man with a question, Wyatt, I said. I sat down across from him. I laid the wooden letter S on his desk. And I want a straight answer. No more mercy. Just the truth. Wyatt stopped rubbing the barrel of the rifle. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at me. He looked tired. Older than he had a week ago. Abigail found Gideon S. files, I said. She found the record of the letter from Santa Fe. The one that was intercepted by Harrison Thorn. The one that could have saved Sarah. Wyatt didn't move. He didn't even blink. She also found something else, Wyatt. She found a note in the margin. Gideon had a witness. Someone who saw Harrison Thorn take that mail from the post office. Someone who knew about the crime and didn't say a word for 6 years. I leaned forward. I looked into the eyes of my best friend. Was it you, Wyatt? Wyatt sighed. It was the sound of a man letting go of a heavy burden. He leaned back in his chair. It was me, Silas, he whispered. I saw him. I was a deputy then. Harrison Thorn owned half the town, and the other half was in his pocket. I saw him take the letter. I didn't know what was in it then. Not until Sarah was already gone. And when you found out? I asked. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. Why didn't you tell me? Why let me believe it was my own ignorance that killed her? Wyatt looked at his hands. Because I saw you, Silas. I saw you break. You were a shell of a man. I thought. I thought if I told you that Harrison Thorne had murdered your wife with a stolen letter, you'd go to his house and kill him, and then I'd have to hang you. He looked up, his eyes wet. I thought I was being merciful, Silas. I thought I was protecting you. I stood up so fast my chair hit the wall. I felt the heat of the betrayal rising in my throat. Mercy, I barked. You call that mercy, Wyatt. Listen to me, and listen good. A lie told out of pity is still a theft. When you kept that truth from me, you stole my right to my own reality. You forced me to live in a world that wasn't real, carrying a guilt that wasn't mine to carry. That isn't mercy. That is a form of control. Wyatt reached out. I just wanted you to live, Silas. Honesty is the only foundation for a true friendship, Wyatt, I said. My voice was low and dangerous. To believe that I couldn't handle the truth is to believe that I am less of a man than you are. It is a lack of respect. True mercy is giving a man the truth so he can stand on his own feet, not wrapping him in a comfortable lie so you can feel better about his pain. Wyatt bowed his head. I was a coward, Silas. I wanted to keep the peace, and I wanted to keep my friend. You lost the peace the day that letter was stolen, I said, and you nearly lost your friend by being his keeper instead of his brother. Justice cannot exist where the truth is hidden, and a community that is built on secrets is just a ruin waiting for the wind to blow. I turned toward the door. Wait, Wyatt said. He stood up. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a yellowed envelope. I kept it, the original. I took it back from Harrison S.'s desk after he died. I couldn't bring myself to burn it, and I couldn't bring myself to give it to you. He held it out. His hand was shaking. I took the envelope. I looked at the handwriting. Urgent, to Mr. Silas Vance. I couldn't read the words inside yet. Not all of them. But I could read my name. I could read the fact that it had been sent. You were going to help me, Wyatt, I said, not as my keeper, as the law. We going to take this to Judge in Santa Fe. We going to show him what the Thorns have been doing in this territory for 30 years. Wyatt straightened his badge. I'll do it, Silas. Not because I want to save my own skin. Because you rewrite. A man deserves to know the ground he is standing on. I walked out of the office. The sun was still hot. The dust was still thick. But I felt lighter. The weight of 6 years of guilt was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp purpose. I walked back to the clinic. Abigail was waiting on the porch. She heard my step. She heard the change in my breath. You found it, she said. I found it, I said. I handed her the yellowed envelope. And I found a friend who finally realized that the truth is the only thing that sets a man free. Abigail took the letter. She ran her fingers over the seal. Friday is coming, Silas, she said. Let it come, I said. We have the word, and we have the truth. And Thorne is about to find out that the blind girl and the illiterate cowboy are the most dangerous people in New Mexico. She meme-cooed. Knowledge is a dangerous thing for a tyrant, Silas. It's the only thing, I said. I looked at the S and the A and the T on the desk. They weren't just letters anymore. They were the names of our lives, and we were finally the ones holding the pen. The Friday sun didn't rise. It glared. It hung in the sky like a brass coin, hot and unforgiving. The wind was high, whipping the red dust into devils that danced across the tracks at the Red Rock station. I stood in the doorway of the clinic. I felt the weight of the Colt on my hip, but it was the yellowed envelope in my vest pocket that felt heavier. Abigail was sitting at the desk. She was dressed for travel dark wool, gloves, her hat pinned tight, But she wasn't moving. She was listening. "The train is 4 miles out, Silas," she said. "I can feel the iron through the floorboards. It is a machine of progress, they say, but it sounds like a hungry beast to me." "Progress is only good if it leaves a man his soul, Abigail," I said. She nodded. "That is the lesson the world forgets. Wealth and speed are not the same as civilization. A truly civilized society is measured by how it protects the rights of the individual, not how fast it can steamroll over them. If we lose our compassion for the sake of a faster rail, we have lost our way in the dark." The door creaked open. Sheriff Wyatt stepped in. He looked like he aged 10 years since the night before. His star was polished, but his shoulders were slumped. "Thorne is at the station, Silas," Wyatt said. "He's got a lawyer with him, and a deputy marshal from Santa Fe. He's looking for the blind ward and the delinquent landowner." "Then let's go give 'em what they looking for," I said. I offered my arm to Abigail. She took it. We walked out onto the boardwalk. The town was watching. They stood in the shadows of the livery and the general store, silent as ghosts. They were waiting to see who the frontier would keep and who it would spit out. We reached the station just as the train pulled in. The steam was a white wall, blinding and hot. Thaddeus Thorne stepped out of the fog. He looked impeccable. He looked like he'd never seen a day of dirt in his life. "Abigail," Thorne said, stepping forward, "the carriage is unnecessary now. The Pullman car is waiting. Your life in the dust is over." He looked at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "And you, Vance, the marshal has the papers. You being evicted for failure to meet the terms of your note. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, even for a man who can read the words." I didn't reach for my gun. I reached for the envelope. "You talk about the law, Thorne," I said. My voice was steady. It was the voice of a man who finally knew the ground he stood on. "But the law is built on truth. And truth is something your family hasn't touched in 30 years. I handed the envelope to the deputy marshal. "That S, a letter sent to me in 1872, I said. "It was stolen from the post office by Harrison Thorne. It contained the cure for a dying woman. It was intercepted to break a man so your father could buy his land for pennies. To steal a man, S-mail, is a federal crime. To steal his wife S-life through silence is a moral crime that no amount of railroad money can ever pay for." Thorne's face went white. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt didn't look away this time. "I'm a witness, Thaddeus," Wyatt said. "I saw your father take it. I have the records. And I have a conscience that has finally finished being quiet." Abigail stepped forward then. She didn't need her cane. She stood tall, her unseeing eyes fixed on the direction of Thorne's ragged breathing. "Listen to me, Thaddeus," she said. "You believe that power belongs to the one with the most gold. But real power belongs to the one with the most truth. A person's right to their own agency and their own history is sacred. You tried to turn Silas S. lack of literacy into a cage. You tried to turn my lack of sight into a leash. But the word is out now, and the word is justice." The marshal looked at the letter. He looked at Thorne. Then he looked at me. "Mr. Thorne," the marshal said, "you'd best come with me. We have some questions about your family-ass business in Santa Fe. And Mr. Vance, it looks like your note was paid in full 6 years ago by the damages your late wife's estate is owed." Thorne opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on air. He was led away, his expensive boots scuffing in the dirt. The train whistled. It pulled away, the steam clearing. Abigail reached into her bag. She pulled out the leather-bound diary of her brother Gideon. "Silas," she said, "there is one more thing. Gideon wrote a final entry. He wrote it for you. He knew he was dying, and he knew you were the only man in this valley who would truly understand what it meant to see through the heart. She felt the page. Her fingers moved over the tactile marks Gideon had left for her. He wrote, "I am sending for my sister, not to save her, but to save this town. She has the sight Silas lacks, and Silas has the strength she will need to stay. They are two halves of a whole truth. If they find each other, they will prove that no disability can dim the light of a human spirit that chooses to love." I looked at her. The wind was blowing her hair. The dust was settling. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew that we are all incomplete until we learn to rely on one another," Abigail said. "Independence is a fine thing, Silas. But interdependence, the choice to care for another soul, is the highest form of freedom." I took her hand. The tracks were empty now. The horizon was wide. "Let's go home, Abigail," I said. "I am already there," she replied. 6 months later, the wind was cool. The red rocks were capped with the first dusting of snow. I sat at the kitchen table in the ranch house. I was alone, but I wasn't in the dark. On the table sat a new letter. It wasn't from a bank. It wasn't a threat. It was a letter from a rancher in the north asking for my advice on breeding cattle. I opened it. I didn't take it to Wyatt. I didn't wait for Abigail. I read it. The words didn't look like scratches anymore. They looked like friends. It took me 10 minutes. I stumbled on a 3-syllable word, but I sounded it out. I felt the shape of the V and the A and the L. I put the letter down and felt a peace I hadn't known since I was a boy. "Education is the only real way to be free," I said to the quiet room. "A man who can read his own world is a man who can never be truly lost. It is a right we owe to every child and a duty we owe to ourselves as adults." The door opened. Abigail came in. She smelled like pine and the herbal tea she'd been brewing at the clinic. She walked straight to the table. She didn't need to feel her way anymore. She knew the map of our lives by heart. "You finished the letter," she said. "I did," I said. "He wants to know about the Hereford mix. I am going to write him back tomorrow." "You're going to write him?" "I am," I said. "My handwriting looks like a chicken walked over a slate, but it'll be my own hand. And that's what matters. Every person has a right to their own voice. To speak for oneself is the beginning of all dignity." I stood up. I walked over to her. I took her hands. "Abigail," I said, "I've been thinking about choices, about why we re here. And I'm not a man of many words, even now. But I know this. Love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose to build, day by day, word by word. It has the recognition that the other person's soul is as important as your own." I took a breath. The house felt warm, safe. "I want you to stay here, not as the doctor's sister, not as the teacher, but as my wife. I want us to build a school for the adults in this town who are still living in the dark. I want us to prove that in Red Rock Springs, no one gets left behind because they can TC or they can T-read." Abigail was silent for a long time. Then she meme-cooed. "A marriage built on equality and shared purpose is the only kind worth having. Silas," she said, "I chose you the day you told me you couldn't read and didn't hide from the truth of it. Because a man who is honest about his weakness is a man who has already found his strength." "Is that a yes?" I asked. "It's a certainly," she said. "We were married on the porch of the clinic 2 weeks later. Wyatt was there. Mrs. Crane was there. Even the blacksmith showed up, holding a book he'd started learning to read in Abigail's evening class. I signed the marriage license. I didn't use an X, Silas Vance. I watched the ink dry. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." "Dignity is not a gift," I told the small crowd. gathered there. It is a birthright. We have spent too long in this territory thinking that the strong must rule the weak. But we have learned that there are no weak people, only people who haven't been given the tools to be strong, literacy, respect, and the right to choose our own lives. These are the tools we were going to use to build this town. Abigail stood beside me, her hand in mine. And love, she added softly. For without love, all the knowledge in the world is just cold stone. Love is the light that allows us to see the humanity in the stranger. That evening, we rode back to the ranch. The sun was setting, turning the desert into a sea of gold and purple. I looked at the horizon. I didn't just see the cattle or the fence lines, I saw the possibilities. I saw a world where a blind woman and a cowboy could change the heart of the frontier. I sat on the porch as the stars came out. I held the wooden S and the A in my hand. The wind blew. It whispered through the sage. I leaned over and kissed Abigail. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about the next chapter," I said. And for the first time in my life, I can wait to read what happens next. The frontier was still wild. It was still hard. But we weren't ghosts anymore. We were the writers of our own destiny. And in the quiet of the New Mexico night, the words finally felt like home. On this channel, we bring heartfelt Western stories filled with cowboys, frontier romance, family love, mercy, sacrifice, and the timeless goodness that can still exist between people. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author, creativity, or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
When the dust finally settles over Red Rock Springs, this story leaves us with more than the memory of a cowboy, a blind teacher, and a battle against greed. It reminds us that the greatest chains are not always made of iron. Sometimes they are made of shame, silence, fear, and the lies we are taught to believe about ourselves. Silas Vance spent years thinking his inability to read made him less of a man. But Abigail showed him that dignity is not measured by what we lack. It is measured by the courage we find when we choose to grow. Through their journey, we learn that knowledge is freedom, truth is justice, and compassion is one of the strongest forces a human being can offer another. Abigail may not have seen the world with her eyes, but she saw people with her heart. Silas may not have known the written word, but he carried wisdom, loyalty, and honor in his soul. Together, they proved that no weakness has the power to define us, when love, patience, and understanding are there to lift us up. This story also teaches us that real strength is not found in domination, wealth, or pride. Real strength is found in standing beside the wounded, speaking truth when silence is easier, and choosing mercy without hiding justice. In the harsh world of the frontier, where many men fought for land and power, Silas and Abigail fought for something far greater, the right of every person to be seen, respected, and given a chance to become whole. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. No one should be left in the dark, whether that darkness comes from blindness, illiteracy, grief, or loneliness. Every soul deserves light. Every heart deserves dignity. And every person deserves someone who believes they are still worth saving. Thank you for listening to this Western tale of courage, love, truth, and redemption. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Share it with someone who loves meaningful Western stories. And subscribe to the channel for more tales of cowboys, frontier love, family bonds, compassion, and the timeless humanity that still shines through the dust of the Old West.